Okay, so let's look at some of the most challenging samples that you can come across. Me and Calypso often do a lot of training all across the world, and one of the samples which consistently comes up is banknotes and currency. And how do we photograph finger marks with lots of different treatment types on banknotes? Now with DCS, we can employ a number of different methods to photograph fingerprints on banknotes. This could be either using lighting techniques, either with the camera, or we could even do this sometimes with the software to remove difficult backgrounds. So here I have a selection of different banknotes from around the world. One of the things I'll first show you is why are banknotes difficult in the first place? Well, first of all, it can be something as simple as the colours that are used, the patterns that are used, but you'll also have hidden security features. So for example, if you're using a treatment type which maybe fluoresces, what you may also find on the banknote as well is you have security features that fluoresce along the same wavelengths actually as your treatments. So if you were to have fingerprints in these areas, it may then be very, very tricky to photograph the fingerprints because of that background fluorescence. Sometimes there's only a few small security features, and it may be okay in the areas where if your fingerprint is not over those security features, but it is a consideration we actually have to make. So sometimes the methods that you use on other more simple sample types are not going to work as well on these more challenging samples. So let's have a look at a couple of different ways that we can either use lighting or the software to help us to visualize these fingerprints. So let's first have a look at some different lighting techniques that we can use. Now, quite often we have security features in banknotes which are to our advantage when photographing finger marks. Pretty much every banknote on the planet will have some form of infrared security feature where parts or huge parts on both sides of the banknote could drop out under the infrared. When you hear myself or Calypso talking about something dropping out, what we mean is it disappears or it fades and becomes less visible. Now, the way that we can then employ this on DCS is we can use infrared light to drop out these backgrounds to make the fingerprint more visible. Now, this only works with certain fingerprint treatments. So if you ever want to use infrared, one of the things I will say to you is don't try and use or photograph ninhydrin finger marks under infrared, because actually ninhydrin disappears under infrared. So for the examples I have here, in this example, we have a €5 note, and I actually have powdered with black fingerprint powder, just a black kind of granular fingerprint powder, over the areas of the map and on the aqueduct on the top of the banknote. And all we're simply going to do is we will place our banknote under our infrared light source. And what you actually see on the screen is all of that pattern has disappeared. We might have some security feature here in the banknote where we can see the 5 and the euro marks. There's also serial number as well. But actually in the areas where the fingerprint is visible, that area of the pattern has disappeared. Now, the way this is working is actually with those dark fingerprint types like dark powders, black powders, those types of fingerprint treatments will actually absorb infrared light. So this is doing the opposite, where if something absorbs infrared light, it actually makes it darker. If we just take a preview here, the effect that we're getting is we're actually seeing the background reflecting the infrared and dropping out, but we're then seeing the fingerprint powder absorbing the infrared light and getting darker. And this is a really simple way of building contrast between your fingerprint and the background of something like a banknote. Then we might just want to do some basic enhancements just to build that contrast back again, and there you get your finger mark. Very simple and easy. But that's not going to work every single time with every single sample, because what happens if you get a finger mark on something that doesn't drop out? This is where we can actually use special fingerprint powders. But that's not going to work for every single sample type. And particularly with banknotes, the other challenging aspect we have to consider is we have now some countries use polymer banknotes and some still use paper banknotes. So things like powders are not always going to be the most useful treatment type to use on there. Particularly with sequential processing, powders tend to come last in the process, because once you use a powder on a surface, you usually cannot do any other form of treatment after that. Now, if you're not able to use powders on your banknotes, or maybe you want to try something else first, then we have some other ideas. Now, the first example is actually going to be our FP Natural 2 powder. Now, I am going to say the word powder here, which I know I've just said, that powders usually come last in the process. But powders can also be used in another way. So actually, if you have something treated with cyanoacrylate, we can powder on top of the cyanoacrylate. And that way, maybe if we want to try something else, we can remove that powder afterwards. FP Natural 2 powder is an infrared fluorescence powder. So it's very similar to what we've done, but it's slightly more special. Now, infrared fluorescence, we're still trying to do that dropping out of the background. But what we're trying to do is we're creating fluorescence inside the infrared part in the spectrum. And because we're creating that infrared fluorescence, we can see the bright fingerprints, but we can also try and remove the background surface. So FP Natural 2 is a very simple powder to use, simply applied on top of super glue with a Zephyr brush. You can use a marabou style brush as well to remove any excess debris on the surface. But then all we're going to do is use, again, simple lighting techniques. So we have our Crime Light 8x4 here, and we have our special sharp cut filter that's provided for use with FP Natural 2. Now, FP Natural 2 we can illuminate in two different ways. So the first way is simply to illuminate with a red light source. Now, when we turn on a red light source, what you get is the fluorescence is inside the infrared part of the spectrum, even though we're still illuminating in the visible. If I just make a few adjustments here. Okay, we'll take a preview image. And here you can see we have lots of nice different finger marks all across the surface. So actually the red can be really, really useful. And if you have really nice, clear finger marks, they can be quite easy to see. However, when you use the red light, we're still not going to get that full background removal that you might see with the infrared reflectance. So there's another way to actually photograph FP Natural 2. And that is actually, we're going to use the same filter, but we're going to switch to an infrared light source. And this is really key to FP Natural powder, because we're illuminating now inside the infrared, but we're also viewing inside the infrared, which means that we're looking at a very small slice of the spectrum, which allows us to cut out the backgrounds. So if I now adjust that slightly, what we'll now see is we'll see those same finger marks, but this time the background has completely dropped out. Just changing simply into grayscale, and we'll capture this. So now we're not getting any of those security features fluorescing, because they're fluorescing inside the visible. But we're also seeing a lot of those infrared security features dropping out as well. And again, a little bit of maybe just contrast, brightness, gamma. We can go into our toolbox as well. Maybe just go into our powders. Just give it a nice smooth. And there we go. And there's our nice clear finger marks.